outside for about an hour. My name is Kevin Harris. I'm the Associate Director of Princeton's Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. We're happy to co-sponsor this event today with the Lichtenstein Institute, and I'm very honored to introduce Professor Amin Saikal. Anybody who's been reading about the Middle East, whether an academic or just someone who's a Middle East buff, has probably encountered Professor Saikal's name over the past 3 or more decades. He was actually born in Kabul in 1950. I tried to count all the books that he's written, and I'm probably missing a few, but I counted at least 6 single-author books and at least 3
enabling them to declare Iran an Islamic Republic with an Islamic system of governance and an independent pro-Islamic foreign policy. The new Islamic Republic faced hostility not only from leftist and liberalist groups from within Iran that it overcame at the cost of thousands of lives. It was also rejected by the United States and many of its allies as fundamentalist and unacceptable in the international system. As Washington grappled with the loss of Iran as a vital strategic foothold, another episode that poisoned US-Iranian relations further was the Iranian hostage crisis. A group of Khomeini's militant supporters invaded US Embassy in Tehran on 4th of November 1979 and took 52 embassy workers captive for the next 444 days at the cost of humiliating Washington. While Khomeini had denounced the United States as the great Satan, President Jimmy Carter now portrayed Khomeini as Yazid, the killer of the third Imam of the Shias. The Islamic regime faced international isolation and regional apprehension that could only enhance its sense of fear and paranoia, casting doubts about the chances of survival in the medium to long run. Yet, despite all this, the Islamic Republic has survived those challenges and many more since then. It has endured the 1980-88 Iran-Iraq War, which was the longest, bloodiest, and costliest war ever fought in the modern history of the Middle East. It has also endured the US policy of containment, involving a severe regime of sanctions backed by some of America's allies and threat of military action, advocated and supported strongly by America's regional strategic partner, that is Israel. It is also coped with a number of highly destabilizing developments around it, including the 1979 Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, the 1991 First Gulf War between the US-led coalition and Saddam Hussein's Iraq over Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, the 2001 US-led intervention in Afghanistan, and the US-led occupation of Iraq lasting from 2003 to 2011. Beyond these events, the country has had to deal with growing adversarial attitudes from a number of Gulf Arab states, led by Saudi Arabia. The 2000s, and also it has had to cope with the 2006 war between Israel and Iranian-backed Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the ongoing Syrian crisis since 2011 in the wake of the so-called Arab Spring. The latest development, whose consequences remain unpredictable for Iran, the region, and the West, is the rise of the Sunni extremist Islamic group ISIL or ISIS. ISIL's establishment of a Khilafat or Islamic State since June 2014 on a vast swathes of Iraqi and Syrian territories, and the US-led Western decision to combat the Islamic State has confronted Iran with another daunting challenge. Whilst sharing President Barack Obama's aim to degrade and eventually to eliminate the Islamic State as an extremely dangerous terrorist entity and threat to the region and the West, Tehran has found it necessary to deal with the Islamic State phenomenon in its own way. The Islamic Republic of Iran has indeed experienced a difficult journey of trials through all of these developments. Of course, this has been the fate of Iran for more than 2,500 years. However, the period since the advent of Khomeini's Islamic government has been characterized by a degree of exceptionalism. No Iranian government before it had locked horns with a superpower like the United States. This does not withstand the fact that following the election of the moderate and pragmatic Hassan Rouhani to the Iranian presidency in June 2013, and US President Obama's overtures for improved ties with Iran, US-Iranian relations have lately taken a potentially upward trajectory. The April 2014 Lausanne Framework Agreement for a final deal on Iran's controversial nuclear program by the end of June this year highlights that this trajectory. Against all odds, the Islamic regime has not only consolidated domestically against any threatening disorder, but also emerged as a critical actor in the region. Its regional and international adversaries have increasingly found it expedient to recognize its potential as a force for either stability or instability in the region. The regime's resilience is attributable to a number of factors, but let me focus on three of them, which I think is really worthy of discussion. The first factor of resilience relates to the nature of Iran's quite unique Islamic order, as defined by Khomeini's Shia vision of Islam. Khomeini and his zealous followers melded religious traditions and combined Islamic and nationalist ideas within a very complex framework and established a two-tiered system of Islamic governance that has now become firmly entrenched. One tier is premised on the sovereignty of God, personified by a Wilayat al-Faqih or a supreme Islamic jurist or a figure like Khomeini himself, who is endowed with enormous religious and constitutional authority over the polity. Another tier is designed to reflect the sovereignty of people, represented by a universally elected president and national assembly. To safeguard the longevity of the system, various extra-revolutionary bodies, such as the Council of Guardians, the Assembly of Experts, the Expediency Council, as well as the Revolutionary Guard of Sabah, and its affiliated organization, besiege the armed forces and charitable trusts or economic foundations such as Bunyad or set up outside the formal structures of the three branches of government, but nonetheless linked to one another and to the formal structures in one form or another. These units function within a vigorous system of checks and balances on the one hand, and coordinate when it comes to the issue of the survivability and security of the Islamic order on the other. Khomeini's approach to the construction of the system was not necessarily monolithic, as some analysts have indicated. It was interactively twofold: jihadi or combative to re-Islamize the polity, if needed forcefully, and ijtihadi or reformist, whereby Khomeini's moderate and pragmatist supporters could also play a meaningful role within his system of governance. We considered this as significant in reconstructing an Islamic Iran that would be modern and strong, capable of defending itself against internal disorder and outside adversaries, and operating within a world system which was partly anarchical but largely driven by technological progress and affected by trade resources in the market. He appeared not to allow his ideological zeal to stunt what he was required to achieve in pragmatic terms. Khomeini's approach generated what may be termed a model of theocratic political pluralism. This has provided the Iranian governance system with a degree of inbuilt pluralism which has over time given rise to various Islamic factions, with most notably three of them at the forefront: the conservative, pragmatic, and reformist. Undoubtedly, the system from the beginning weighed heavily in favor of the conservative faction. It has nonetheless contained space for other factions to assume the presidency and the Majlis or the National Assembly through electoral processes from time to time. In other words, Whenever the conservative faction's ideological and policy behavior has proved to be too stagnant, the pragmatists and reformists are vested with an opportunity to engage in a degree of rectification. Hence, the election to the presidency of Hashim Rafsanjani from 1998 to 1997 as the head of the pragmatist group, Mohammad Khatami from 1997 to 2005 from the reformist camp, and moderate Hassan Rouhani from 2013 with the backing of both the pragmatist and reformist factions. This is not to claim that factionalism has not fragmented the ruling clerical elite and resulted in bigger power struggle, as was the case over the disputed result of the 2009 presidential election. Nor is it to assume that the system does not suffer from internal stresses and tensions, as well as patronage, corruption, and a degree of functional ineffectiveness. It basically suggests that the system has a measure of internal elasticity that can enable it to engage in process of reformation when necessary in order to cushion itself against internal wrath and foreign pressure. The second factor which has contributed to the strength of the regime concerns the opportunities that will become available to the Iranian Islamic regime as a result of outside actors, especially the United States, policy behavior towards Iran and its region. Washington's original rejection of the Islamic order and its efforts over the years to contain Iran has ultimately proved to be short-sighted. President Obama is the first American leader to recognize the futility of U.S. policy of containment of Iran. He has acknowledged America's past hegemonic interference in Iran, as in the case of the 1953 CIA meddling, and has resorted to diplomacy as the first instrument to deal with Iran, especially since Rouhani's rise to power. With Iran's nuclear program becoming a defining issue in the country's relations with the United States and its allies, both sides are now availed of an opportunity to reach a settlement on the matter as a possible prelude to the rapprochement between them. This opportunity has risen largely in the context of mutual needs and vulnerabilities. Rouhani won the presidential election with a promise to improve Iran's dire economic situation, caused mainly by years of mismanagement and increased Western sanctions, to relax the political and social controls, and to improve Iran's foreign relations with all countries without shaking up the foundations of the Islamic regime. For this, Rouhani has needed to end sanctions by resolving the nuclear impasse with the United States that could also open the way for an influx of much-needed Western investment and high technology. Equally, President Obama could do with Iranian help for a resolution of a number of pressing regional problems, and the generation of some of which the United States has had a deep involvement. They include the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, which remain the two countries which remain mired in violence and insecurity. In addition, the United States has found itself paralyzed vis-à-vis the Syrian conflict since 2011. It has opposed the Iranian-backed regime of Bashar al-Assad and declared its full support for the moderate Syrian opposition. But in practical terms, the United States has ended up lending support to the Assad regime by confronting the Islamic State and several other rival Sunni extremist groups that have formed the strong elements of the Syrian opposition. Nor has it been able, that is the United States, been able to achieve much in resolving the problems of politically driven confessional problems of Lebanon, where the Iranian-backed Hezbollah reigns politically and militarily supreme. Similarly, the United States has made no progress in securing a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Equally, it has accomplished virtually nothing regarding its purported support for democratic reforms in the Arab world. Authoritarian rule remains dominant across the Arabian domain and lies at the roots of many disturbing developments in the region. The third factor that has helped the Iranian regime is that despite Tehran's strong public Islamic ideological stance as foreign policy is driven largely by nuanced Islamic pragmatic rather than idealistic considerations. It is often relied on its ideological disposition as a source of policy justification and public mobilization and legitimation rather than policy guide. A glance at the Islamic regime's foreign policy behavior from the early years of the revolution indicates that the regime has been quite calculated in most of its behavior. This has been as much the case with its on-again, off-again hardline stance against the United States as it has been in relation to the conduct of its relations with the various regional states and beyond. Tehran has rarely failed to make necessary foreign policy adjustments, albeit on a proportionate scale, when demanded by changes in Iran's domestic conditions as well as regional and international settings. At times, it has given ground, and at other times, it has retreated depending on the realities of the time and the nature of the issues. For example, Tehran's acceptance of an unconditional ceasefire in the war with Iraq in 1988, its neutrality over the US-led military campaign to reverse the 1990 Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, its acceptance of UN mediation to avoid a war with the Pakistan-backed Taliban over the malicious killing of 11 Iranian consul staff in northern Afghanistan in 1998, its decision to back America's overthrow of the Taliban regime and to assist American efforts to conjure the Hamid Karzai government to replace that of the Taliban in Afghanistan in 2001. And, of course, Tehran resolved not to cause any obstacles to the 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq. Lately, the Iranian regime's pragmatic efforts include Rouhani's endeavors to resolve the dispute over Iran's nuclear program and international sanctions. Even in the ongoing Iraqi crisis, despite his distrust of America, Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei has permitted Iranian commanders to communicate with their American counterparts on the ground in support of the US-led mission against the Islamic State. In a similar way, Iran is even provided advisory and combat support to the US allied Kurdish militia Peshmerga, despite its past opposition to any degree of autonomy for the Iraqi Kurds that could help Iran's Kurdish minority to seek a similar status. Ironically, the United States and Iranian regional interests have never been closer, although this comes at a great deal of discomfort for Israel and a number of Arab states. On the flip side, Tehran has used every availed opportunity to boost its soft and hard power in pursuit of regional influence. It has managed largely proxy operations to build a strong leverage in cultivating close relationships with either governments or subnational forces in the region, from Afghanistan to Iraq to Syria to Lebanon and possibly some would argue Palestine. These relationships are not all of a security and military nature. Many of them also have serious political, economic, trade, and cultural dimensions. In this respect, Tehran's activities have ranged from making a substantial financial contribution to the reconstruction of Afghanistan and cash donations to the former Afghan president, Hamid Karzai, and fostering very close cross-border economic and trade ties with Western Afghanistan, to providing large-scale material and non-material aid, including military assistance to the Iraqi and Syrian governments. Bunyad, or the charitable organization which we set up since shortly after the revolution, have been one of the regime's most effective tools in the area of its humanitarian and cultural activities. All this has helped Tehran to build an effective proxy power in the region, irrespective of all the intertwined internal and external pressure on it. Meanwhile, the Islamic regime has invested heavily in building its hard power. Certainly, Iran's military capability has not been tested since the end of the Iran-Iraq war. However, it is not a pushover either. Iran has achieved a level of military organization and fighting capacity whereby, in conjunction with Tehran's proxy forces in the region, it can make an attack on Iran very costly for its perpetrators. All of these factors seem to have persuaded President Obama that in the event of a major breakthrough in the U.S.-Iranian relations, Washington could enlist Iran's assistance in resolving some of the regional problems and improve America's influence in the region, and hence, and his insistence on using diplomacy to settle U.S.-Iranian differences and to do business with Tehran. He has so far managed to override serious objections on the part of his detractors in the U.S. and in the region. The opposition to Obama's reconciliatory moves is mirrored in Iran, where Rouhani has his own hardline factional opponents within and beyond the governmental system at all levels. They include a number of powerful clerical and non-clerical individuals and groups operating in extra-governmental bodies such as the Council of Guardians and, of course, also the Parliament and the media. These forces have a strong vested interest in the continuation of a status quo. However, the Supreme Leader has backed Rouhani in pursuit of a final nuclear agreement, as long as it does not impinge on Iran's status as a sovereign Islamic state and on the country's right under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to enrich uranium. A final nuclear agreement is not assured, but both sides have come a long way from their adversarial positions. In an interview in late December last year, President Obama said that Iran has a chance to get it right, and has stated that if they do, there is incredible talent and resources and sophistication inside of Iran, and it would be a very successful regional power that was also abiding by international norms and international rules, and that would be good for everybody. Rouhani and his able foreign minister, Jawad Zarif, have reciprocated this by being very conciliatory towards the United States. An alternative to a negotiated settlement of nuclear issue could be a military confrontation, which both sides want to avoid. A final nuclear deal would have the potential to redefine the regional strategic environment. It could open the way for a U.S.-Iranian entente, with serious implications for the correlation of forces in the region. In spite of their present apprehension, Saudi Arabia and its allies in the Arab world may find themselves with little choice but to scale down their concerns about what they perceive as Iran's regional sectarian and geopolitical ambitions. Similarly, the Iranian Islamic regime will have less reason to feel that the Gulf Cooperation Council, led by Saudi Arabia, acts as a part of a U.S.-backed plot to undermine the Iranian regime's position. Such developments could shrink the arena for the geopolitically driven sectarian Iranian-Saudi proxy conflicts in Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen, as well as for Saudi Arabia's deepening strategic ties with nuclear-armed Pakistan, an alliance which may have been in part motivated by the mutual search for future assurances against Iran in the event of the latter or the Iranians acquiring a military nuclear capability. It could also have a nuclear agreement could also help the process of stabilization in Afghanistan, as the Saudis and Pakistanis will have less concern about countering Iranian influence in the war-torn country. The wider implications of a U.S.-Iranian rapprochement could be a viable resolution of the Syrian and Iraqi crisis. Even Israel may have fewer reasons to view Iran as an existential threat and to negotiate a settlement with the Palestinians based on the internationally backed principle of a two-state solution. Let me conclude. Whatever one's view, the Iranian Islamic government is now well entrenched. In the final analysis, it is proved to be a widely responsible actor, not an irrationally fundamentalist as one it has been often portrayed in the West. Given the state of the turmoil in the Middle East, the United States and its allies have two choices, either to isolate or engage the Iranian regime. The best option is to engage it, and through this, help the reformists within what is essentially a pluralist ruling clerical struggle to succeed in achieving their reformist agenda as advocated by Rouhani. The more Rouhani succeeds in his reformist objectives, the more he will be able to show the tangible benefits of his conciliatory dealings with the United States. This may help to dampen the efforts of his critics and boost the position of moderates and reformists to persuade their hardline opponents that they need to fall in line with changing times. Similarly, the successful implementation of reformist policies will place President Obama in a better position to convince his domestic critics and, of course, regional critics to modify their behavior towards Iran, and as a corollary, help him to resolve the longest and most damaging conflict in the region, and that is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A U.S.-Iranian rapprochement could trigger a cascade of win-win situations for all parties involved in the increasingly turbulent but oil-rich Middle East. The Islamic Republic of Iran is potentially on the verge of a new direction, at least on the foreign policy front, if only the opportunities could become more and more available to it. Thank you very much.
Ample time for questions. We have a lot of people here. So, were there any students here who would like to ask a question? I might do the end. So, let's just take some questions, and then if we have many, we'll start to take round. For now, sir.
Thank you. Wonderful. You didn't comment, and I would ask that you do, on Iran's relationship with Russia and China, both in terms of economics and in terms of security, and how that plays over in the Middle East.
Yeah, I think that is extremely important, and of course, Iran has forged very close ties with Russia and with China. Although the economic ties with Russia is far less than it is with China. At the moment, it only amounts to about $4 billion a year, whereas with China, it is $45 billion a year, and that's very, very substantial. Now, of course, the Saudis and the Iranians are really competing with one another as far as their relation with China is concerned. And the Saudis' volume of trade is going up to something like in 2015 was $75 billion. I mean, there seems to be very close geostrategic relationship development between Tehran, Moscow, Beijing, and of course also that really helps the Assad regime in Syria, as well as indirectly Hezbollah and so on. But that is at the same time tied to much wider issues. That is U.S.-Iranian relations, U.S.-Russian relations, U.S.-China relations, and of course Europe-Russia, Europe-China relations. And I feel that the problems of in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and of course in Afghanistan could be assisted enormously, not only by the improvement in relations between Tehran and Washington, but also through grand border strategy, if could be struck between Washington, Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, Ankara, Riyadh. I feel, and that in that strategy there has to be trade-offs. You know, there are things that the United States have to really give away in order to really get the support of the Chinese, and more importantly, I think Putin's Russia. You know, at this point, I really don't see that emerging on the horizon. But I would like to remain hopeful that as these crises and the Middle East continue, that finally somebody like the UN Secretary General will step out as a more neutral body and try to convene a regional conference with the support of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council in order to reach a regional consensus on the Middle East, and at the same time perhaps a regional consensus on a new international order. But that's really far down the line. But of course, I'm a bit of an academic dreamer, and I don't stop being.
So we have Dr. Michael Berry and then Professor.
Yes, Dr. Saikal, you mentioned the irony of the Syrian situation where Obama, in confrontation with the Bashar al-Assad regime, finds himself a few years later practically on the same side as the Assad regime because of the greater threat of the Islamic State, and hence the Iranian Republic, the Assad regime, and the United States, with a common enemy, find themselves on a common side. Would you see something like this possibly developing in Yemen with the growth of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula as the Yemeni state collapses, whereby fundamentally the United States might decide that maybe helping the Houthis is a better idea?
That's a very good question, and a very complex one for us. Look, I think at this stage, the United States does not see it in its strategic interest to lend any support to the idea of backing the Houthis. But if there is going to be a comprehensive nuclear agreement by the end of June or thereabouts, that may well really open the way for a major improvement in U.S.-Iran relations. I think ultimately, if you really look at the region, Iran is a much bigger prize for the United States to gain, which is really missing in the overall American strategic calculations in the region for 35 years, 36 years. Of course, that is a source of very concern for a number of Arab countries, and likely also for Israel. And that also explains the apprehension of these states when it comes to an improvement in the U.S.-Iranian relations. I think only then there is a possibility that the United States, and of course that will also depend who is going to really succeed President Obama, may have an opportunity to make an overall assessment of America's Middle East policy. And only in the context of an overall assessment of America's Middle East policy, then I think there could be considerations that how the conflict in Yemen could be solved. As far as you know and as I know, the government has virtually collapsed. The president has fled the country. Is no longer there. It is only the Saudis who is really supporting the Hadi's government. But at the same time, there's a four-way contest, power struggle going on in Yemen. You have the Houthis, you have the Al-Qaeda, you have the Saleh supporters, the former president, and you've got Hadi supporters, which is still supported by Saudi Arabia and a number of others. If you want to fight Houthis, which the Saudis are doing at the moment, together with their Arab allies, you could possibly help Al-Qaeda. And this is what's happening. Al-Qaeda has already taken over a port, an airport, a number of villages, a number of towns, and so on. Now, the United States will have to really weigh or see which side you want to be on. Against its own enemy, and for that matter, the deadly enemy, Al-Qaeda, or perhaps, possibly, or potentially, a reformist Houthi-led government. Which one do they want? And also, we know that something like 25% of the Syrian population is made up of Shia. Of Yemen. Okay. So but I think ultimately, because of the tribal nature of Yemen and so on, whatever government is going to come into existence, and will have to really be based on some sort of constitutional model, and it has to be some form of a coalition. Just, I think, as the case, really the case with a country like Afghanistan, you are a world's leading expert on that country. And I think, in Afghanistan, you're not going to, you have to have some sort of form of a coalition there. But whether it can really work, particularly in relation to the current one, that's something debatable and we can really discuss.
Professor Twinkler?
Yes, thank you so much for your talk. Looking at the performance of Rouhani so far, most people note that he has entirely prioritized the foreign policy agenda. He has put nearly all of his eggs in the basket of the nuclear deal and is expected to deal with domestic troubles once he's able to buttress his position on the basis of a success in the negotiations, if that will materialize. Now, during his campaign, he hasn't really championed much sort of a push towards civil liberties, greater shift of power towards the electoral institutions. So I wonder what you think one can expect of Rouhani if the negotiations should prove successful at the end of June, and if he really will have a greater ability to push back against the conservatives inside Iran. So in terms of the domestic policy agenda, what can we expect of him if he will be successful in foreign policy? And I also wondered, we see once again a tendency by the conservatives to push back against dissidents, mostly through the judiciary and the intelligence ministry, something we already saw during the reformist era under Khatami. Therefore, the human rights situation today has not at all improved compared to the Ahmadinejad era, something that the president has hardly any bearing on and can hardly push back on so far. Nevertheless, I wonder whether you see any variation in terms of how the judiciary and intelligence ministry are instrumentalized in order to silence dissidents compared to the early 2000s, whether you can see any tendencies in variation.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I mean, you're absolutely right. But I think Rouhani leadership has put or made a lot of investment and foreign policy area. That's mainly because, as you know, they want to really put an end to the sanctions. The sanction has not really affected the Iranian state to the extent that may have been desired. The Iranian state has been able to get around the sanctions. But I mean, they've got water agreements with China, they've got water agreements with India. You're still selling sufficient oil to Japan, to South Korea, to a number of countries. And quite a bit of oil is also smuggled out. I mean, there was also another way of really getting around the sanctions. They used to ship or send a truck full of Iranian riyals to Afghanistan. Afghanistan is awash with American dollars, and the Iranian riyals were converted into American dollars, were brought back to Iran, and then the Afghan merchants brought the Iranian riyal back to Iran and bought the stuff and took it back to Afghanistan. So there are ways of really getting, that. So it hasn't really exactly brought the Iranian government to its knees, but it has affected the society, and there's no question about it. And I think that the radical leadership really feels that's affected the society, and they have to really do something about that. So, to me, it appears that Rouhani's first priority is to see if he could get an end to the sanctions. I think that's it. The second priority is to see if we can bring about a number of structural economic reforms, because the Iranian economy is in a dire state at the moment. Iran needs foreign investment, Iran needs high technology, Iran needs to overhaul its oil industry, and haven't been able to do that. And then thirdly, I think you would like to really, if that's possible, to improve human rights situation in Iran. But that can only come if he shows to the public and if he shows to his hardline opponents that, look, his policies, his foreign policy initiatives have really paid off in terms of economic reforms, in terms of improvement in the living conditions of the public. I mean, that is when he's able to really do that. But I thoroughly agree with you that so far, I don't think Rouhani's government has achieved much on the domestic front. I don't think he's been able to implement any important or signal political reform. And he's not going to be able to do that for a while. I mean, as you know, that system is so complex, it's an incredibly complex system, which is sort of set up. So that, whether this approach is going to pay off, well, we just have to really wait and see how that's going to go. And also, Rouhani is going to face an election in 2 years' time. So we will see what's going to happen. And if he brings the goodies home, then I think he may stand a very good chance to be re-elected. If he doesn't, then there could be a swing back to the hardliners. But at this stage, I mean, from my assessment of the situation on the ground in Iran, I don't think the majority of the Iranian public want to really go back to the Ahmadinejad era. I think that's out. That's really gone. The conditions have changed, the circumstances have changed. I don't think it's going to be easy for hardliners. It's not just as not easy for the Taliban to come back to Afghanistan and to rule Afghanistan in the same way that they did, 15 years ago, or 14 years ago. In fact, there was a meeting of the Taliban with the Afghan representatives in Doha, Afghan government representatives a couple of days ago. And for the first time, they raised the issue of women's rights in Afghanistan. And they say that you're not against the women education. Of course they're coming and they're seeing what's happening in Afghanistan. They can't really go back to those sort of things. So I think that's it. I think in terms of the intelligence, of course, the revolutionary guard very, very strong. It's a very powerful force in Iranian politics, economics, and of course security. Altogether. And the conservatives still control the intelligence services. There's no question. I think Rouhani knows that, Zarif knows that, other members of their cabinet really know that. But there's not a great deal that they can do about it at the moment. So they are really banking very much on the success of the negotiations over the nuclear issue. I think if they succeed on that front, that will open the way for other things to achieve. But as I said earlier, whether this strategy is going to really work, I think that needs to be seen.
We have 3 questions, so maybe we'll take all 3. So where's Professor Menashri?
Oh no, you're testing my...
No, I'll remind you, because there's probably going to be some over there. So.
I find myself in a very bizarre situation. From Israel, back home, I'm struggling with the government to say that Iran is not yet black. And here I am sitting today to say that Iran is not yet rosy, that the picture I think that you portrayed, except for this response to the lady here, I didn't see the question mark that you promised that there are question marks, because your views are so clear that everything is in place. All the world is in land and Iran is... I said, I don't want to go into whole lectures. The system of government in Iran is complex. That's fully agree. But I don't think it's fair to say that it's based on God on one hand, and legitimacy from God, legitimacy from people. I don't see the legitimacy from people. It was in 1978, 1989 when the government came to this, but I think since then, I don't see the people. Because when you have a presidential elections, you have 800 candidates, and a religious establishment decides that only 4 or 5 can run, this is not the rule of the people, as you know from Australia and I know from other parts of the world. So it's, and here I think that at the elections of 2009 were one example of what the Iranian people saw. It's not, and they questioned the results of the elections. And basically, the 2 people, the 2 leaders who were running against Ahmadinejad in 2009, they are still under process. I think the least that Rouhani could have done is do something in terms of human rights, and something in terms of political rights of people. And it's not sufficient that Zarif goes to NYU and says that in Iran, no one is in prison because of his political views. It's almost exactly like Ahmadinejad saying in Columbia University that in Iran there are no gays. So it's, there are problems in Iran, and they've not been addressed in the last few years or something. The other point that I not go beyond it, I don't think it would be fair to say that the American hostile policy towards the Islamic Revolution led to the strengthening of the regime. It helped in different ways. First, when in the revolution, all Iranians, almost all Iranian opposition would blame President Carter as the man who kicked out the Shah out of the country. The policy of President Carter was not supportive of the Shah and actually abandoned the Shah. But the Iranian regime took advantage of this animosity. The slogan of Khomeini, you know Khomeini and his philosophy, you go back through his books in the 60s, his animosity to the United States was there much before. It was related to the Islamic Revolution, not as a result of the Islamic Revolution. So I think that another thing that the country that cut relations between the two is Iran cut relations with the United States and not vice versa. So the idea that the claim is shouting death to America, neither the East nor the West, strengthened the Iranians as much as even I would say all the criticism against Israel are helpful to the Islamic regime because they need an enemy and Israel is an easy enemy. Not that there are not good reasons to hate Israel, but I think that they make out of it more than. Finally, I'd say that I would suggest not to refer to Rouhani as a model because his performance in 1999 that Iranian students were suppressed and in 2009 he is pragmatic. And pragmatism does not necessarily mean moderation. So I agree that he's pragmatic, and I wrote an article about him being pragmatic and has suffered criticism from enemies of him. So that's the bizarre situation. The Iran is really very complex, and I think the balance should be in between.
You had in your remarks commented on the strong vested interest in the status quo, you had said, in certain constituencies of the Islamic regime in enmity with the United States. I wonder if you could explain a bit what the vested interests are. That is it a question of budgetary access or is it a question of political influence? And distinguish that from what might be, and I hope that you will be able to explain to what extent this exists, an enmity among the passionately religious for the United States. I mean, there is a reason that the favorite shorthand for the U.S. is the Great Satan. It has a religious inspiration. How deeply ingrained is that? And is that really any different than the Sunni extremist, furious hostility against the United States? And how pervasive is that in the power networks and maybe in the at least rural population? And second, aside from Iraq, where we gave them a Shiite majority government, with which of Iran's bordering neighbors does it actually have good relations?
It seems to me that Israel is seeing Iran in terms of the Holocaust. Now, they have Hezbollah. The question is, there are three possibilities why Iran might object to Israel. I don't know. I don't think that's true, that it is a Holocaust issue. However, one thing could be, does Iran see Israel, who has nuclear weapons also, as a strong military power, as a competition, okay, to them in the future, okay? The other thing is, do they see Israel as not a Middle Eastern country? It's a European country, really. And third, is the Palestinian issue a key problem? I don't know.
Well, I can remind you.
Those are three possibilities. I don't know. I don't know why.
No, that's fine. Let me just go through the comments that you made, points that you really raised. You asked that where is the question mark? First of all, I totally lose the picture of Iran. There are also problems with Iran. That's really acknowledged and clearly acknowledged. The country is not in a great position as people think. Where is really the question mark? That I said, the main question mark is over the nuclear negotiations. That a final agreement is not assured. It's possible that it will not materialize. If it doesn't, it's going to be very damaging to the Iranian regime. And it's going to be very damaging to Rouhani's government. But could also equal quite a setback for the Obama administration. That is where really the question. And then the question is where the Rouhani government will go from there. That's why there is this question. Just in very brief. I think on the question of that Iran is not a democracy, it's still a autocratic, theocratic state, and the system is theocratic, and Mousavi and his colleague who ran for presidency, they were still under house arrest and all these sort of things. Yes, but don't expect Iran to become a replica of Muslim democracy. And don't expect any other countries in the region to become a replica of Muslim democracy. Why? Why do you expect that? These people have got their own history, their own culture, their own way of life. They've got their own value system. Why would you want them to become a replica of either Israeli democracy or for that matter American democracy? It hasn't really worked in Iraq. It hasn't really worked in Afghanistan. That's what the Americans maintain. They went with a promise to bring democracy, stability, security to Afghanistan, to Iraq. Look at where are we? Where are we with the democratic process? The point is that within the framework which has been established, and I keep saying, I said that this is a theocratic political pluralist system, which it is. And I preceded the whole thing of saying theocratic. It is. Within that framework, there is a measure of democracy. There is a measure of public participation in the political processes and policy implementation processes. I mean, that exists. Let's acknowledge that. To say that, Iran, after all these years of theocratic rule, which has gone through back and down, suddenly become a replica of Western democracy. No, that's not really the case. And that hasn't really worked in the case of Iraq. It hasn't worked in the case of Afghanistan. But let's see what could possibly evolve from what the Iranians is trying to achieve. I'm not saying for a minute that Rouhani is going to be able to turn the Iranian system into a full-blown democracy, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow. But the point is that this it's a process, it's a journey. Establishing the process of democratization is a journey, not an event. It takes a long time. On the issue of the United States, why should the United States should take the blame or at least be a source of U.S. policy actions be a source of strength for the Iranian regime? Well, as was pointed out, you rightly pointed out, it was the United States which opened the way for Iran into Iraq. This is the American policy calculation, which in many ways is not really wrong. Iran has got very strong leverage in Afghanistan. Iran perhaps is the second powerful player now in Afghanistan after Pakistan because of its relationship with Taliban. We know that these policies, the fact that the United States has not been able to play a very meaningful and effective role in resolving the Syrian crisis, of securing a resolution of the Syrian crisis, has played into the hands of the Iranian regime. The fact that the Palestinian problem is not resolved, that's played into the hands of particular hardliners in Iran. They've all taken advantage of that. And as I said, they have never really failed to exploit opportunities when they come to the way. Yes, of course, but name me one state or one regime which opportunities have become available to it and is not exploited those opportunities in order to strengthen its position, both domestically and on a foreign policy front. That's always been the case. I mean, I don't think there's any country which is sort of saying, oh look, the only country which perhaps an opportunity came its way, said, no, we don't want to really take this opportunity, was Saudi Arabia when it was selected to the Security Council of the UN. And they say, no, I don't want to really take it. But that is not a big issue for the Saudis. And you say that, well, Iran needs Israel as an enemy. But some people argue that Israel equally needs Iran as an enemy. They
doesn't negate each other.
Yeah. They're both playing on that. There's no question about it. But there's also an understanding between them. And I'm told that even Prime Minister Netanyahu, privately, people who have discussed it with Prime Minister Netanyahu, prodigy has a lot of admiration for the Iranians. He has for the Iranians. He has a lot of admiration. And also, don't forget,
he should have said,
yeah, so let me just go to the issue of the vested interest in the status quo. Well, you know, forces like the hardline clerics, the Revolutionary Guard, the besieged, various revolutionary committees, the bunyads, which have been responsible for creating a system in Iran. They don't want it to change because it will affect their interests. They are very much interested in the continuation of the system because they benefit.
Can you distinguish the hardline clerics seem to be a different kettle of fish than the besieged, the Revolutionary Guard, and the security services?
Yeah,
depend financially.
Sure.
Is the hardline clerics?
Nobody really knows.
Right.
Yeah, but I mean, the point is that there are two things about Iran. One is, as far as I can see, that power is evolving in Iran. It's not constant. It's very difficult to work out exactly who is the repository of power. We know that the supreme leader has enormous constitution and religious authority. But there are also other centers of power in Iran. So things are not worked out in Iran monolithically. Often it emerges as a result of some sort of consensus. That's what comes out. And there are hardline elements who have very strong position and the support the Revolutionary Guard and the bunyads and the besieged and a number of the revolution, including the Council of Guardians and so on. This is not only confusing for the Iranians, but mostly it's confusing to the outsiders. If you want to deal with Iran, you really often wonder who should you really deal with, whether you're a businessman or a political figure, whatever. You know, that's the main. But from the Iranian regime's perspective, that's fine. It's just they've been playing with this for a long time. The more the public is confused, and the more the outsiders are confused. Evidently. But they know what they're doing. And they know how to really get things sort of together inside. That's whether that will work in the medium to long run, who knows? Probably not. On the issue of, is there a passionate clerical segment with hostility towards the United States? Yes. At the moment, there are three groups with a focus on Iranian nuclear negotiations, on nuclear program. One is what they call a group of fatalists, that it is within the administration. They don't want to give an inch to the outside world. And they say if there's going to be a war, let it come. It's the will of Allah. We will face it. Yes, there are elements. Then there is another group that says, look, I think it's important that we go, that we acquire the technology, the know-how, but not to cross the threshold. Because this is going to be disastrous for Iran. And then there's another group of people. I personally think that Rouhani and his foreign minister and so on belong to the group that says, okay, we've got the technology. We have the know-how. People cannot take that away from us. Even if they bomb us, they cannot take that away from us. But what's the point of really crossing the threshold? Weaponizing? What for? How is that going to really help Iran? So there is different groups operating.
the ruling clerics all the time. And I was also asked which of Iran's neighbors, which kind of neighbors Iran has got very good relations with. Well, you can say the same thing about China. China's neighbors are very close friends of China. You can hardly be Republican Catholic. Yeah, you can say the same sort of. But I think in the case of this relationship with Afghanistan, quite good. It's quite strong leverage there. It's got very strong leverage in Iran. It's got very strong leverage in Lebanon, even if there are certain groups in Lebanon which hate the Iranians or the Iranian interference, but they have to cope with it. I mean, it's there. Okay, the Arab countries. Now that you cannot expect any of these Sunni-dominated countries to emulate the Iranian model of governance. That's not going to happen. But also, I mean, although there is a great deal of tension between Iran and Pakistan, but the Iranians have got enough influence that when the Pakistani Prime Minister tells the Saudis that we are going to come and support you and your operations in Yemen, then the Iranian Foreign Minister could easily fly to Islamabad and have discussions. And here is the Iranian Parliament, that's the Pakistani Parliament, passing a resolution saying, no, the Haramain and Sharafain, that the two holy mosques, two holy sites of Islam have not been invaded. Only when those two holy sites are attacked, then it's the responsibility of all Muslims to go and defend those holy sites and Saudi Arabia. But now, it is Saudi Arabia attacking another country. Yeah. So the Iranians still got good reasonable working relationship with Pakistan. Things with Turkey is not a relationship that will be carried, but more at the political level, not at the economic level. At the economic level is booming. The volume of trade between the two countries actually is something like $70 to $80 billion a year, and expanding. And Erdogan just visited Tehran, to smooth out things. Because Erdogan himself is quite confused at the moment. He doesn't know whether he should really throw his weight behind Saudi Arabia and therefore this notion of Sunni bloc in the region, or really maintain good relations with Iran. So he's sort of putting his own. Do the Iranians or the Iranian regime views Israel as a European piece of real estate in the heart of the Arab world? Yes. And Israel is. That does not erode the legitimacy of the state of Israel. But it is a very much a European state in the heart of the Arab world. In Israel has made little efforts to really integrate itself into the region. I've sat with Israeli leaders and I've heard them that they would like to really stand above the region rather than being on the ground in the region. Okay, that's the prerogative of Israel. That's fine. But don't expect the countries in the region, including Iran, to come and bring you and say, oh look, we recognize you as part of the region, and instead of really seeing you as a very much a European entity there. Again, that is not to question the legitimacy of the state of Israel. I want to emphasize that. But you ask me whether, how it's that the Iranians view that. Yes, of course we do that way.
Why do you feel that Iran sees Israel as an enemy? Why does Iran look at Israel as an enemy rather than just not liking it? Okay?
Yeah. Well, I think, when this really goes back to the time of Khomeini.
Okay.
This goes back to the time of Khomeini. When the
Khomeini.
advent of the Islamic regime, Islamic government in Iran. Khomeini dichotomized the world between mustazifin and mustakbirin, those who rule and those who are ruled. He said he's come in order to empower the ones who are ruled, the mustazifin, he identified himself as the champion of the Mustazabin cause. And as far as he was concerned, the Palestinians were Mustazabin. And the third holy site of Islam was occupied by Israel. That's as far as he was concerned, the East Jerusalem. Right? And that established a legacy for the Iranian nation. That from the very beginning, it adopted an anti-US, anti-Israeli posture.
Anti-Europe?
Not so much Europe, but Israel. But no, I have talked to some Iranian officials in private. They say, particularly in the last few years, we really don't have much against Israel. Why we should really be against Israel? Because Israel is so far away from us.
Yes.
And God knows, listen. But sometimes it's very difficult to really overcome an ideological legacy, which has been sort of ingrained into your political psyche. And that's what's happened. But lately, Nazif made a statement just about, I think it was Zarif about 2 weeks ago, where he said that we want to have good relations with all the countries in the region. If it was Ahmadinejad, would have always excluded Israel. All the countries in the region. We are making, and they are sort of tweeting messages for Jewish holidays and congratulations and this and that. But I think these sort of things take time. But it also really depends on how long Zarif is going to be in power and how long Rouhani is going to be in power and all these sort of things that we just have to really watch the situation, how it's going to work.
So let me channel my inner Wolfgang. Just make one point.
Oh, because he's not here.
Because I'm here, so someone has to represent Wolfgang. So look, the division of the world into two halves, or anti-Zionism, or the Great Satan, these aren't Islamic, doesn't necessarily Islamic origins. They're third worldists. Because Khomeini was well versed in third worldism, and so he was reading at least translated versions through other Iranian intellectuals of Frantz Fanon, who was the person who divided the world into this. So it's not to say that these things are derived specifically from Islamic principles. Even the Iranians themselves know that there are bigger contexts in which the revolution took place. And that's why, of course, things can change. For about 8 years in the United States, we had no interlocutors, at least sane interlocutors, on the Iranian side to explain their worldview in language that we could understand. And so voices filled that gap in Washington. And one of the arguments that was made for 8 years in Washington, D.C., you could open up the New York Times and read it in the op-ed page, was that it's an ideological principle, it's a precept of the Islamic Republic that they cannot have engagement with the United States because of some kind of principle of Great Satan. And in fact, our policy, at least was justified upon that for many, many years. There's no point to negotiate because they will never engage with us. And of course, the people who said, there were people in Iran who always said that too. People who said that, yeah, it's those people today who are advocating negotiating with the United States today, including the leader and supreme jurist. So we can say that nothing changes in Iran, that if they say something 10 years ago, we're going to hold to that position. But that's not, then we're doing politics as much as they're doing politics, including Rouhani. When Rouhani did bad things, he's like George, you could say George Wallace did bad things, and George Wallace converted. But lots of politicians changed their mind, changed their policies. So that's not a very good analysis of the trajectory of Iran. So yeah, I think we probably should end it now because we've had a very good discussion and always should leave the audience wanting more.